Hey everybody, it's your old pal Wood Doofus. If you're like me and you made some cornhole boards or you were thinking about making a cornhole board, you might have thought that a 6-inch cup saw is the way to go for cutting your 6-inch hole in the board. I've used this 6-inch cup saw a few times now, and the problem that I'm running into is that my drill will start to smoke and overheat. And that tells me that this process of cutting into the plywood with this is just too much for my drill to handle. Now you might have a better drill and maybe it works for you, that's great. But I'm going to investigate some different ways to cut this 6-inch hole. Alright, so first things first, we're going to mark the center point of where the hole is going to be. It's going to be 9 inches from the top and 12 inches from either side. So now we have the center point where those two lines cross. So I want to try to cut the hole with a router, and I have two routers here. My plug-in router has a big circle base and my palm router has a square base. Since I'm cutting a circle, I think it's going to be easier to use the router with the circle base. I do have a Jasper Circle Pro, which I can use to cut all these different sizes of circles. But as you can see, it only goes down to 7-inch, and I need a 6-inch hole. And you probably can buy these in smaller versions that might cut a 6-inch hole. But to me, setting this thing up with the router connected to it is a little bit too time consuming and awkward anyway. So I'm developing a different system. So in order to cut a 6-inch hole with this, I need to measure the distance from the edge to the center point of my router so I can set up a fence, a circle fence, that I can move along to cut a 6-inch hole. And I can use this jig to cut the circle fence, at which point I'll have a consistent jig that I can use over and over again in a simple way. So right now I got a 1/4-inch spiral upcut bit in this, so I have to adjust any measurements by a 1/4 of an inch to make sure it comes out right. So here's the confusing part, and maybe some of you geometry whizzes can chime in on this, but I wanted to cut a 6-inch hole and I measured the distance from the center to the end point of my router, and I got that about 3 inches. So I figured if I wanted a 6-inch hole, all I have to do is add 3 inches to that radius and I would get a 9-inch hole, and then I could use that 9-inch hole as the fence to make a 6-inch hole. But when I did that, I ended up with this 4-inch hole instead of the 6-inch hole that I was going for. So all I did, even though I don't understand it, was calculate the difference between the 4-inch hole and the 9-inch that I made, and I came up with a 5-inch difference. So in order to get the 6-inch hole, all I had to do was add the 5 inches, which is the difference between this, and make a bigger hole, which is an 11-inch hole. But I also need to calculate the width of the bit, which is a 1/4 inch, so I'm going to cut an 11 1/4 inch hole, and that should make a 6-inch hole. Oh, and by the way, I got it right here, 11 inches. That's the size I need in order to cut a 6-inch hole. And once again, this is going to be my fence for the router. Now, if you don't have a Circle Cut Pro and you don't want to get one anytime soon to cut the 11 1/4 inch hole, you can always make yourself your own little jig. I made this one before I had the Circle Cut Pro, and it was designed to use with my palm router. So I put a box in here that my palm router sits in, and I set the pivot point to the diameter of the circle I was going for. So if you're making one 11 1/4 inch circle, just make one of these little jigs out of scraps, and then you're good to go. So the next issue becomes centering my jig so that the hole ends up where it's supposed to be, with the center point at the cross hashings that I made earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this center point with a little divot here. And now I'm going to take the cutoff circle that I cut out of this OSB, and it has its center point marked because I needed it marked in order to cut the circle with the Circle Cut Pro. So I have the center point of this circle, and if I set that in the hole here, which is hard to do because you can't see underneath it. There it is. But luckily I marked the hole so it would sink in. Then we can put our jig around there and go ahead and clamp it down. Now if you want, before you clamped it down, you could get some kind of 1/4-inch spacers and put them all around there, and that way you know it's perfectly centered. But I'm just going to eyeball this and see that it's relatively the same gap all the way around, so I should be good to go. In hindsight, you could make this jig a little better from the beginning by cutting a piece of this OSB or whatever you want your fence to be made out of to fit the dimensions of your cornhole board. So you would set it at 24 inches and maybe another 18 inches. And then you would mark the 9 inches from the top edge and the 12 inches from the sides. Find your center point and then cut the circle, and that way you can set this material square with your board each time without having to do any centering. So maybe in the future I'll do that. All right, so we got a pretty good hole there. Now let's go ahead and take off the jig. Now all I gotta do is take my palm router, which has got my round over in there, and go ahead and round over the top. Alright, so that's one way to cut a good 6-inch hole in a cornhole board. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and check out my other videos if it's your first time here. And as always, don't be afraid to be a doofus.